Thank you, Phil. So Phil originally asked me to talk to you kind of about Kinect, but that seemed way too boring, so I decided to do something different. You all are guinea pigs, so I have to do a presentation in 2 weeks, so I'm running it on you. So, you know, if you love it, you can give me all the applause in the world. If you hate it, just be quiet and I'll know. So I'm going to have to go a little fast because I only have 10 minutes here, and this is supposed to be a 20-minute presentation, but that's okay. So the request that was made of me was to kind of talk about energy as a transitioning marketplace. Seemed kind of odd to me because the request made it sound like this is something new, like energy is going through a big, massive change right now. So I decided to go back in history a little bit. I'm not going to run through all these, and these dates aren't perfect. These are dates in which things were happening, not necessarily when they started. But any of you that have a little bit of gray hair and been doing this for a while can remember the vast majority of these events. And the point being, if we go all the way back to 92, so what's that, 27 years ago, energy has never been static. It changes every single day. I mean, we can kind of go through this, you know, at any given point in time, we either have too much energy or not enough energy. The price goes all over the place. And so the real trick in this industry is not necessarily understanding what's happening today, but it's really understanding what is going to happen tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because if the past is any indication, every year something big and new is going to happen. So I just decided to focus on a few things that we hear about that are in the news now, and kind of what do we think is going to happen, and then my own personal projection for where things could potentially go. So we're leaving the realm of reality a little bit here and going into projection. So obviously many of you remember when President Trump was running and coal is coming back, which I thought was really odd considering I live in the state of Kentucky, which is a massive coal state and it's been dying for years. But somehow we're going to bring it back. Well, the reality is that's not going to happen. Coal didn't die because of the government. Coal died because it just is too expensive. Natural gas is a lot cheaper. Renewables are putting a lot of pressure, causing coal retirements to go even faster. The remediation effort that is required in operating a coal-fired power plant, much less shutting it down, is ridiculously expensive. It's not like, for instance, a natural gas plant where you can literally stick the engine on the back of a flatbed and just turn it on. And then to build a new coal-fired power plant isn't going to happen. Costs way too much to build, costs too much to operate. The reason why you have plants that are currently running is because we've already invested all the money, and we don't necessarily have a replacement for it today. We talked about regulating hydraulic fracturing. Still hasn't happened. Don't necessarily see it happening anytime in the near future. There is not enough public pressure at the moment to cause that to happen. And in our current administration, they definitely aren't going to do it. Doesn't mean something couldn't happen in the future, but I'm not seeing it. And then the third one, there's this idea out there that renewables make energy cheaper, right? Because the sun is free. We all know that, right? Wind is free. Well, the reality in terms of the way we operate today, that's not actually true. The way we operate today, the more we rely upon renewables, the more expensive energy gets. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is because they are not reliable. The sun isn't out all the time. The wind doesn't always blow, or certainly doesn't blow where we want it to blow. When you're talking about hydro, depending upon the nature of the hydro, the water doesn't always run at the rate we want it to. In order for the grid to handle that, it costs a lot more money. So yes, it's great that we utilize those, but it's not necessarily making it less expensive for us on our power needs. So what's going to happen in the future? So I decided to pick one topic, one that is talked about a lot, which is actually storing electricity, right? We can store natural gas. That's what allows us to actually function as a country. A lot of people don't realize that when it gets really cold in the wintertime, we cannot move enough gas from production to people actually being able to burn it. If you would have gone back when we had the epic winter, so a couple years ago, and done the math, when we came out of the winter, had we had a really hot summer and burned a lot of gas, we ended up having a mild summer, but had we had a hot summer, we would have had a problem going into the next winter of being able to store enough gas in order to have the amount we needed for the next winter. Wasn't really talked about, but that was true. So we have this idea of storing electricity, and what would that do to us in terms of the North American energy markets? What opportunities would that create for us? And is it even a reality? So let's just pick on one thing. Let's pick on Tesla. So Mr. John Bodine's here. He hates Tesla because, well, actually, you love Tesla. You just like betting against them. But let's take a look at Tesla. So their Model 3, they're expected to produce 500,000 of these once they get their plant in China up and running. So what does that mean? So if you just kind of do the math and you take the mid-size battery, the 62 kilowatt hour battery, at 500,000 of these, if you produce that many in a year, if you assume that you can fully charge that battery, so you'd have to assume that these cars, when they're not running, are hooked up to the grid, which is kind of the plan if you could actually make all this work. So you could get 2 full 8-hour AC charging cycles. If you charge them on DC, you can do it a lot faster, but that isn't readily available. So take all that math. That means that you could be able to store and then send back out approximately 4,000 terawatt hour, or sorry, 22 terawatt hours of battery storage from these. So that's 500,000 cars. So let's assume you kind of extrapolate that out. And if, as the pundits actually predict, electric cars become more of the norm rather than the exception, you've got approximately 4,000 terawatt hours is the annual consumption of electricity. Based on those metrics, that means that you would need 90 million cars to be able to store that much electricity to allow us to produce power whenever we wanted to, store it in a car battery, and then release it again. So 90 million cars, that's a lot, right? Well, we've got 276 registered cars in the US. So it's approximately one. So if you had 1/3 of the cars that were electric, that basically met those requirements, you'd have the ability to store the entire electric consumption needs of the country. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but for those that sit around saying it would never happen, the metrics would tell you you're wrong. And unfortunately, I meant to put what the average car life in here, and I don't have it yet, because that would just kind of give you an idea of how fast it would take to turn over the existing gas combustion cars to get there. So what would it mean if we actually had the ability on any large scale to store electricity? Obviously, you would have a lot more opportunities in terms of hedging your price if you are a consumer. Just like we do in natural gas, you'd have physical ability to buy power when it's cheap and then to be able to utilize it when it's more expensive, just like we do with natural gas. Yes, you can do it financially, but you'd be able to do it literally physically as well. We'd have more renewables. Renewables make a lot more sense when you can store the energy as opposed to having to move it and use it at the exact same time. You'd have more generation choices, which just kind of plays into more renewables. It doesn't matter so much how the energy is generated, or for that matter, where it's generated. Obviously, you'd have improved efficiency in terms of the entire the grid system, because if you could actually move the batteries themselves as opposed to having to move the electricity across these long lines and get all that line loss, that would give you some flexibility. I'm not going to go through all these. The emissions are kind of obvious. Your car in your house could suddenly be a moneymaker. You actually act as part of the grid, and you can store that electricity for a fee. So all this is being talked about out there in the news. These aren't my ideas. You probably would see more electrification of process. We've already shown that a electric car can actually have quite a bit of torque, something we never thought could happen, a lot of speed. They can accelerate very fast. Now think about machinery that today we utilize oil, natural gas, something else in order to be able to get the combustion that we need and the power that we need. And from a pricing standpoint, if electricity suddenly became a lot cheaper and you could store it, you may see more machinery moving towards being electrified. What are the other potential opportunities and effects? This one's always the interesting one to me. Potentially unlimited range. I still believe that we look at the electric car completely wrong. We keep trying to figure out how to charge it fast. It's completely unnecessary. What you need to focus on is figuring out how to replace the batteries. So you've got actually a concept car down there where they put all the batteries on the bottom, and when they need to recharge, they just pull the batteries out and they put new ones in that are already charged. So think about going to your gas station and just, as opposed to filling up your tank, you go, yeah, just switch out my batteries. You'd have to have a common battery, just like we do with plugs in the wall. You couldn't have a million different types, but it is possible. So we kind of talked about coal a little bit. Well, what about nuclear? I mean, one of the things we like about nuclear is it's cheap, zero emissions, but if you start moving towards battery storage and we have a higher reliance upon renewables, does that cause nuclear to start going down the same road as coal is? You already have some countries that have moved down the road of phasing out nuclear. In this country, we kind of went through we didn't build any nuclear for 30 years. We had a bunch of plants on the board, and now we've kind of backed off of nuclear again. Where would the price of power go to? I don't have that answer, but it's not going to go up as a result of this. It's going to go down. And it could actually, the more you're relying upon renewables that don't necessarily create the problems they do today, power could get pretty cheap. So what happens to natural gas at this point? Does the ability to store electricity start putting pressure on the natural gas market? Do we move towards more electrified options that don't require natural gas? Do you actually see natural gas production of electricity stop in terms of its increase? Because it's been moving up every single year. Does it potentially start going down? I don't have the answers to that question, but then what does that cause the price of natural gas to do? Presumably it would cause it to go down. So you kind of get this spiraling effect that the price of energy is just going down into the basement. What about electric planes? First of all, they exist today. This isn't some brand new concept. The first one was actually created in 1957. But in terms of on a commercial basis, there are companies out there, EasyJet's in partnership with a company I can't pronounce or never heard of, to actually build, it's like a 189 passenger electric plane. So the difference is, if I got my math right here, that a fuel-based plane's got like 40 times more thrust than an electric plane would. However, the efficiency of an electric plane is substantially more. So they believe with technology, eventually they can bridge that gap to where an electric plane is a possibility, as opposed to a consumption plane. Looks a little different because all the engines are actually sitting in the wing. You don't have anything outside the plane itself. More regulation, God only knows what we will do from a governmental standpoint at any point in time if you decide to move towards battery storage. What is the potential dangers of that? What do we want to control? What other effects do you have? This has been my concern for a long time. If you decrease the reliance upon fossil fuels, which wouldn't happen fast, but if you do, think about where most of the oil is produced. Think about where most of the revenues for those countries come from. What destabilizing effect does that have when you take away their money? That's what I get really, really concerned about. So you can just kind of see where a lot of these countries are. Again, I don't know. I'm not a political expert, but it does bother me. That is it. I think I tried to do it in 10 minutes.
And you did a great job.
There we go.
Any questions for Peter? Anybody? Peter, thank you very much.
Not a problem. So